Some wounds never heal, no matter how much time passes or how hard you try to forget. Staff Sergeant Colin Reese knew this truth better than most. He'd been living with his secret for 5 painful years. Hidden beneath his uniform sleeve was something that shouldn't exist. Strange lesions that oozed yellow fluid and pulsed like they were alive. He told himself it was just the price of that mission that went wrong. The cost of serving in places the government pretends don't exist. But during a routine training exercise, Colin collapsed. At the base hospital, a young doctor unwrapped his carefully hidden bandages. What she found wasn't a normal wound. It was something that would lead them both into a mystery the military wanted to keep buried. What happens when a soldier's darkest secret becomes the key to uncovering an experiment that was never supposed to see the light of day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton as Staff Sergeant Colin Reese adjusted his sleeve for the 1,000th time. The gesture had become as automatic as breathing, a subtle tug that ensured the fabric covered every inch of his left forearm. At 34, Colin carried himself with the measured confidence of a man who had served his country with distinction for 16 years. His service record read like a textbook example of military excellence. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, commendations for valor in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the quiet respect of every soldier who had ever served under his command. But records, Colin had learned, never told the whole story. The base was already alive with activity by 0600 hours. Soldiers jogged in formation along the perimeter road, their cadence calls echoing off the brick buildings that housed everything from administrative offices to the medical facility where Colin now found himself walking past with deliberate casualness. He had a routine for avoiding the hospital, a careful path that took him around the building rather than through the courtyard where Dr. Sarah Chen often grabbed her morning coffee. Dr. Chen was 28 years old, fresh out of her residency at Johns Hopkins, and possessed the kind of analytical mind that made her both an excellent physician and, in Colin's estimation, potentially dangerous to his carefully constructed life. She had arrived at Fort Braxton 3 months ago as part of the Army's new initiative to bring civilian medical expertise to military installations. Her credentials were impeccable medical degree from Harvard, specialty training in trauma surgery, PUBLISHED research in military medicine. But it was her curiosity that kept Colin awake at night. The base medical facility was a modern structure, all clean lines and efficient design, nothing like the field hospitals Colin had known in combat zones. Inside, the floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the air carried that distinctive hospital smell of disinfectant and possibility. Dr. Chen's office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the main courtyard where soldiers often gathered during their off-duty hours. Colin's commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, had been like a father to him since his early days as an enlisted man. Webb was in his mid-50s now, his hair more gray than brown, but his bearing remained that of a soldier who had earned his rank through competence and courage rather than politics. The colonel had served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in the Gulf War, and had the kind of institutional memory that made him invaluable to younger officers seeking guidance. Reese has always been one of my most reliable non-commissioned officers, Webb had told Dr. Chen during her orientation briefing. Steady under pressure, leads by example, takes care of his people. If more soldiers had his dedication to duty, this army would be unstoppable. What Webb didn't know, what no one knew, was that Colin's dedication to duty had been tested in ways that would have broken lesser men. The secret lived beneath Colin's sleeve like a malignant thing, hidden by layers of gauze and medical tape that he changed twice daily in the privacy of his quarters. The routine had become ritualistic, carefully peeling away the old dressing cleaning the area with antiseptic that never seemed to help, applying fresh bandages with the precision of a man performing surgery on himself. The wound, if it could be called, that defied every assumption Colin had about healing, about medicine, about the natural order of things. And it started 5 years ago during a mission that officially never happened. The operation had been designated Echo 7, a black ops insertion into a region that appeared on no maps and was acknowledged by no government. Colin's team had been handpicked for the assignment, 8 of the Army's most elite soldiers, each with unblemished records and unquestioned loyalty. They had been told they were destroying a terrorist weapons cache. They had been told many things that turned out to be lies. The lesions first appeared 3 weeks after the mission, small discolorations that Colin initially attributed to some exotic infection picked up in the field. But they didn't behave like any infection he had ever encountered. Instead of responding to antibiotics or healing naturally, they had grown and changed, developing their own rhythm, their own purpose. The yellow fluid that seeped from them carried no odor, contained no bacteria that military physicians could identify, and seemed to pulse with its own internal timing. Colin had sought treatment initially, reporting to the base medical facility with a carefully crafted story about a training injury. But when the standard treatments failed and the questions began to multiply, he had made the decision that would define the next 5 years of his life. He would handle this alone. The cover-up required meticulous planning. Colin learned to forge medical documents to intercept his own test results, to maintain the fiction that his injury was healing normally. He studied wound care with the intensity he had once applied to military tactics, becoming an expert in bandaging techniques and antiseptic protocols. Most importantly, he learned to function normally despite carrying something that felt increasingly alien beneath his skin. His daily routine at Fort Braxton had been carefully calibrated to avoid suspicion. Colin woke at 0430 hours, 30 minutes, before reveille, giving himself time to change his dressing and ensure that nothing showed through his uniform. He ate breakfast in the mess hall with the other non-commissioned officers, participated in training exercises with his usual competence, and filed his reports with the punctuality that had made him a model soldier. But the thing beneath his sleeve was changing. Lately, Colin had begun to notice patterns in its behavior. The pulsing seemed to respond to his emotional state, quickening when he was stressed, slowing when he was calm. Sometimes, especially late at night when the base was quiet, he could swear the lesions were trying to communicate something. The thought terrified him more than any enemy fire he had ever faced. Dr. Chun represented everything Colin feared most about his situation: scientific curiosity, married to medical training, and the authority to ask questions he couldn't answer. He had watched her from a distance during her first weeks on base, noting her methodical approach to patient care and her tendency to dig deeper into cases that other physicians might dismiss as routine. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they encountered. Colin had heard other soldiers discussing her respectfully, but with the kind of interest that attractive, unmarried women often generated in military environments. What concerned him wasn't their attention to her appearance, but the stories about her determination to solve medical puzzles that others found unsolvable. The irony wasn't lost on Colin that he was attracted to the very qualities that made Dr. Chun dangerous to his secret: her dedication to healing, her refusal to accept easy answers, her willingness to challenge authority when patient care was at stake. These were admirable traits that could destroy the life he had built on concealment. As Colin walked past a medical facility this particular morning, adjusting his sleeve with practiced nonchalance, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully maintained world was beginning to show cracks. The thing beneath his skin had been more active lately, the pulsing more insistent. as if it were responding to some external stimulus he couldn't identify. He paused at the corner of the building, looking up at the window of Dr. Chun's office. The blinds were closed, but he could see the glow of artificial light behind them, suggesting she was already at work, despite the early hour. Colin wondered what cases occupied her attention, what medical mysteries she was unraveling with the same determination that had earned her a place on the Army's most prestigious medical team. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of a military base coming to life. Engines starting, voices calling out commands, the rhythmic sound of boots on pavement. These were the sounds that had shaped Colin's adult life, providing structure and purpose, even as he carried his burden in solitude. Today, however, something felt different. As Colin stood in the shadow of the medical facility, he experienced a moment of premonition so powerful it stopped him in his tracks. The sensation was impossible to explain, part intuition, part physical awareness, as if the thing beneath his skin were responding to an approaching change in his carefully ordered world. He dismissed the feeling as anxiety and continued toward the training facility where his squad would be conducting urban warfare exercises. Colin had always prided himself on his ability to focus on the mission at hand, to compartmentalize personal concerns in service of professional duty. This morning, however, the discipline that had sustained him through 16 years of military service felt strained to its breaking point. The training exercise was scheduled to begin at 08:00 hours, a routine simulation that Colin's squad had performed countless times. As he walked across the base, greeting fellow soldiers and reviewing the day's objectives, Colin forced himself to project the calm competence that his men expected from their squad leader. But beneath his uniform sleeve, the thing that had defined his secret life for 5 years began to pulse with an urgency that made him stumble slightly as he walked. For the first time since the lesions had appeared, Colin wondered if his ability to conceal their existence was finally reaching its limit. The training exercise began like countless others Colin had supervised over his career. The morning was crisp, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. His squad of 12 soldiers moved through the mock urban environment with the precision that came from months of working together under his leadership. Remember, this is about communication and coordination, Colin called out as his men took positions behind concrete barriers designed to simulate city buildings. Charlie team, I want you to provide covering fire while Alpha moves to secure the objective. The facility buzzed with the controlled energy of military training. Other squads worked through their own exercises on adjacent sections of the course, their voices mixing with the sound of blank ammunition and the occasional shout of an instructor correcting technique. Colin felt the familiar satisfaction that came from watching his soldiers perform with competence and confidence. These men trusted him to prepare them for real combat, to give them the skills they would need to survive in hostile environments. It was a responsibility he had never taken lightly. But as the exercise progressed into its second hour, Colin began to notice something was wrong. The pulsing beneath his sleeve, which had been unusually active since morning, was now becoming painful. Sharp jolts of sensation shot up his arm with increasing frequency, as if the lesions were responding to some stimulus he couldn't identify. Colin gritted his teeth and continued directing his squad, but the pain was becoming difficult to ignore. Sergeant Reese, you okay? Private Johnson asked during a brief tactical pause. The young soldier had been with Colin's squad for 8 months and had developed the kind of observational skills that made him a valuable team member. Fine, Johnson. Focus on your sector coverage, Colin replied, but he could hear the strain in his own voice. The pain intensified suddenly, a burning sensation that felt like acid eating through his flesh from the inside. Colin's vision blurred momentarily, and he had to steady himself against a concrete barrier to keep from stumbling. Alpha team, advance on the objective, he managed to call out, but his voice sounded distant to his own ears. The world began to tilt sideways. Doc Colin had experienced combat injuries before, shrapnel wounds, bullet grazes, the kind of trauma that came with serving in active war zones. This was different. The pain seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than flesh and bone, as if the thing beneath his skin was trying to claw its way out. He watched his squad continue their advance through a haze of increasing disorientation. Their movements seemed slower, their voices echoing as if coming from a great distance. Colin tried to radio for a tactical pause, but his hands refused to cooperate with the simple task of keying his microphone. "Sergeant." Someone was shouting his name, but the sound seemed to come from underwater. The last thing Colin remembered was the taste of dirt as the ground rushed up to meet his face. The base medical facility's emergency department was a model of efficiency, designed to handle everything from training injuries to the kind of trauma that arrived on medical evacuation flights from overseas deployments. When the call came in about a squad leader collapsing during a routine exercise, the response was immediate and professional. Dr. Sarah Chun was reviewing patient charts when the ambulance arrived. Through the window of her office, she could see the medics wheeling a stretcher toward the emergency entrance. Something about the urgency of their movements caught her attention, and she made her way downstairs to see if her assistance was needed. "What do we have?" she asked Dr. Martinez, the emergency department physician who was already examining the patient. Staff Sergeant Colin Reese, 34 years old, collapsed during training. Witnesses say he seemed disoriented before losing consciousness. Vitals are stable now, but his blood pressure was elevated when the medics brought him in. Dr. Chun looked down at the unconscious soldier on the gurney. She recognized him immediately, the man who seemed to go out of his way to avoid the medical facility, who never appeared on the patient rosters despite 16 years of military service. His face was pale, with a sheen of perspiration that suggested his body was fighting something internal. "Any known medical conditions?" she asked. "None on record." His file shows standard immunizations, a few minor injuries over the years, but nothing significant. "Guy's been healthy as a horse, according to his documentation." Dr. Chun frowned. In her experience, healthy soldiers didn't collapse without reason during routine training exercises. "Let's get him into examination room 3. I want a complete workup, blood chemistry, CBC, cardiac enzymes, the works." As the medical team prepared to move Colin to a private room, Dr. Chun noticed something that made her pause. The patient's left sleeve was bulkier than his right, as if something was wrapped beneath the fabric. More concerning was a small stain that had seeped through the material, not blood, but something yellowish that didn't match any bodily fluid she recognized from her medical training. "Dr. Martinez, look at this," she said, pointing to the discoloration on Colin's sleeve. "Probably just sweat," he replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Dr. Chun had built her reputation on attention to details that other physicians might overlook. During her residency at Johns Hopkins, she had diagnosed cases that had stumped more experienced doctors simply by noticing inconsistencies that others dismissed as irrelevant. The stain on Colin's sleeve might be nothing, but it deserved investigation. In the examination room, with Colin still unconscious, Dr. Chun began her assessment with the methodical approach that had made her one of the Leesbrusbone of the Bataillon, Army's most promising young physicians. Blood pressure was returning to normal, heart rate was steady. Pupils were reactive, all signs pointed to a brief episode, rather than a serious medical emergency. But the stain on his sleeve continued to bother her. "I'm going to need to remove his shirt for a complete examination," she told the attending nurse as they carefully lifted Colin's uniform top. Dr. Chen immediately saw that her instincts had been correct. The patient's left forearm was wrapped in multiple layers of gauze and medical tape, far more extensive than would be needed for a simple training injury. The dressing was professionally applied, suggesting either medical training or extensive practice. "This is interesting," she murmured, photographing the bandaged area for his medical record. "When was the last time this wound was documented?" The nurse checked the computer terminal. "There's no record of any current injury requiring ongoing treatment." Dr. Chun felt the familiar excitement that came with encountering a medical puzzle. In her experience, patients didn't maintain elaborate wound dressings without good reason, and they certainly didn't conceal those dressings from medical personnel unless they had something to hide. Colin began to stir as she prepared to examine the bandaged area. "Sergeant Reese, can you hear me? You're in the base hospital. You collapsed during training." Colin's eyes opened slowly, taking a moment to focus on his surroundings. When he realized where he was and saw Dr. Chun standing beside his bed, his expression shifted from confusion to something that looked very much like panic. "I'm fine," he said, trying to sit up despite the obvious weakness in his voice. "Just got overheated. Happens sometimes. I'd like to run a few tests to make sure." "Everything's okay," Dr. Chun replied calmly. "But first, I need to examine this wound on your arm." "When did you injure yourself?" "It's nothing. Old training accident. Already been treated." Dr. Chun had encountered reluctant patients before, but Colin's evasiveness was particularly striking. His body language suggested genuine fear rather than simple embarrassment about a minor injury. "The dressing looks recent, and there appears to be some drainage. I really should take a look to make sure there's no infection." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Colin had intended. He modulated his tone and tried again. "I appreciate your concern, doctor, but it's being handled by my regular physician." "And who would that be?" "I don't see any referrals in your file." Colin's pause lasted just a moment too long. "Dr. Harrison, off base, private practice." Dr. Chun made a note in his chart, knowing she would verify that information later. "Sergeant, I understand your preference for continuity of care, but you're in a military hospital after collapsing during duty hours. I have a responsibility to ensure that you're medically fit to return to active service." The standoff continued for several minutes, with Colin becoming increasingly agitated and Dr. Chun growing more determined to understand what she was dealing with. Finally, she made the decision that would change both their lives. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, but I'm going." To have to insist. If there's an active infection, it could be affecting your overall health and may have contributed to your collapse today. Before Colin could protest further, Dr. Chun began carefully removing the outer layer of tape. What she found beneath made her stop and stare in professional bewilderment. The gauze was saturated with a yellowish fluid that had the consistency of serum but didn't smell like any wound drainage she had encountered in her medical career. More disturbing were the lesions themselves, not the clean edges of a surgical wound or the irregular pattern of traumatic injury, but something that looked almost organic in its complexity. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "how long is your wound?" "Looked like this?" Colin's face had gone completely white. "You don't understand. You can't document this. It's classified." "Classified?" Dr. Chun looked up from the wound site. "Sergeant, I'm a physician. There's no such thing as a classified medical condition." "There is for this one." The lesions seemed to pulse as she watched them, a rhythmic movement that coincided with Colin's elevated heart rate but followed its own internal pattern. The yellow fluid seeped from openings that didn't look like normal tissue breakdown, but rather like intentional structures, almost like pores in some exotic organism. Dr. Chen had seen thousands of wounds during her medical training and residency. She had treated combat injuries, surgical sites, burns, and every type of trauma the human body could sustain. This was unlike anything in her experience or her medical textbooks. "Sergeant Reese," she said carefully, "I need you to tell me exactly how this injury occurred." The sound of boots on linoleum announced Colonel Webb's arrival, before he appeared in the doorway of the examination room. His face carried the expression of a commanding officer who had received an unwelcome report about one of his most trusted soldiers, but when his eyes fell on the exposed wound site, his expression shifted to something Dr. Chun couldn't quite interpret. "Dr. Chun, I need to speak with you privately," Webb said, his voice carrying the authority that came from 3 decades of military service. "Colonel, I'm in the middle of examining. Now, Doctor." Dr. Chun glanced between Colin, who was trying unsuccessfully to rewrap his wound with one hand, and the colonel whose bearing suggested that this conversation would happen whether she cooperated or not. She carefully covered the lesions with a sterile drape and followed Webb into the hallway. "Colonel Webb, your sergeant has what appears to be a serious medical condition that requires immediate attention. The wound characteristics are unlike anything I've encountered in my training." Webb closed the examination room door and positioned himself so that his body blocked the window. "Dr. Chun, you're new to military medicine, so let me explain something about how things work here. Some injuries occur during classified operations. Some medical conditions require security clearances to discuss. This is one of those situations. With all due respect, sir, there's no such thing as a classified wound. If Sergeant Reese has an infection or some other medical condition, it falls under standard medical protocols regardless of how he acquired it. Does it?" Webb's question carried an edge that made Dr. Chun reconsider her position. What if that wound contains biological agents that were encountered during a mission that officially never happened? What if examining it further could compromise national security? Dr. Chun felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "Are you telling me that Sergeant Reese was exposed to biological weapons?" "I'm telling you that. There are aspects of military service that civilian physicians aren't equipped to handle. Sergeant Reese is under my command, and his medical care will be handled through appropriate channels." "And what channels would those be? Because I don't see any documentation of ongoing treatment in his file." Webb's pause lasted just long enough to confirm Dr. Chun's suspicion that there was more to this situation than standard military procedure. "That information is above your clearance level, Doctor." Before Dr. Chun could respond, the examination room door opened and Colin appeared, having managed to rewrap his arm with the supplies available. His face was still pale, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Colonel, I'd like to return to duty as soon as possible. Sergeant, you collapsed during a training exercise. I can't clear you for active duty without understanding why that happened." Dr. Chun interjected. Colin's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something that looked like desperation. "It won't happen again. I just got overheated. The medical evidence suggests otherwise. Your wound requires treatment, possibly surgical intervention." "The drainage alone indicates, Dr. Chun," Webb interrupted. "Sergeant Reese will be transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center for evaluation by specialists who have the appropriate security clearances. Your involvement in this case ends here." "Doctor." Chun felt her professional instincts rebelling against what was clearly an attempt to remove her from a case that needed immediate medical attention. "Colonel, transferring a patient with an active, undiagnosed condition could be dangerous. At minimum, I need to stabilize. The decision has been made, Doctor. I'll expect your preliminary report on my desk within the hour, and I trust it will reflect your understanding of the sensitive nature of this situation." As Webb and Colin left the examination room, Dr. Chun stood in the hallway feeling as though she had just witnessed something that challenged everything she understood about medical ethics and military protocol. The image of those pulsing lesions remained vivid in her memory, defying every category of wound pathology she had studied. Back in her office, Dr. Chun sat at her computer and stared at the blank incident report form. The cursor blinked patiently as she considered how to document what she had seen without compromising her professional integrity or inadvertently violating military regulations she didn't understand. She began typing a clinical description of the wound characteristics, but stopped when she realized that her observations raised more questions than they answered. The lesions didn't behave like infected tissue. The drainage didn't match any pathogen she could identify. Most disturbing was the rhythmic pulsing that suggested some form of autonomous activity within the wound site. Her phone rang, interrupting her documentation efforts. "Dr. Chun, this is Major Rodriguez from Military Intelligence. I understand you examined Sergeant Reese this morning." "Yes, though Colonel Webb has indicated that the case is being transferred to Walter Reed. Before that happens, I need to speak with you about your observations. Are you available for a meeting this afternoon?" Dr. Chun felt as though she was being drawn into a situation that extended far beyond routine medical care. "Major, I'm not sure what I can tell you that wouldn't be covered in my medical report." "Dr. Chun, Sergeant Reese's condition may be related to ongoing national security matters. Your medical expertise could be crucial to understanding what we're dealing with." After ending the call, Dr. Chun found herself staring out her office window at the base courtyard, where soldiers went about their daily routines with no knowledge of the mystery that was unfolding in the medical facility. She had entered military medicine because she wanted to serve her country, while practicing the kind of challenging medicine that kept her intellectually engaged. This situation was certainly challenging, but in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her computer chimed with an incoming message marked Priority Classified. The sender was listed as Major Rodriguez at Milent, and the subject line read, "Medical Consultation Request, Echo Series." Dr. Chun opened the message and found a brief note asking her to report to Building 47 at 1400 hours for a classified briefing related to her examination of Sergeant Reese. The message included instructions for handling classified information and a reminder that disclosure of any material discussed in the briefing could result in criminal prosecution. As she read the message, Dr. Chun realized that her curiosity about Colin's wound had opened a door to something much larger and potentially more dangerous than a mysterious medical condition. The reference to Echo Series suggested that whatever had happened to Colin was part of a broader pattern, possibly involving other soldiers with similar conditions. She spent the remaining morning hours researching everything she could find about unusual wound characteristics, exotic infections, and biological agents that might produce the symptoms she had observed. Her search led her through medical databases, military health records, and published research on biological warfare, but nothing she found matched what she had seen beneath Colin's bandages. At 1400 hours, Dr. Chun presented herself at Building 47, a nondescript structure on the far side of the base that housed various administrative and intelligence functions. Major Rodriguez was waiting for her in a conference room, equipped with the kind of security measures that indicated the discussion would involve classified material. Major Lisa Rodriguez was in her early 40s, with the bearing of an officer who had earned her position through competence rather than political maneuvering. Her handshake was firm, her manner direct, and her questions about Dr. Chun's background thorough enough to suggest that this meeting had been planned well before Colin's collapse that morning. "Dr. Chun, I appreciate you taking time from your schedule for this briefing. What I'm about to share with you is classified at the secret level, and I need your verbal confirmation that you understand the legal implications of that designation." "I understand, Major." Rodriguez opened a manila folder and removed a photograph that she placed on the table between them. "This is satellite imagery of a facility that was destroyed 5 years ago during a classified military operation. The mission was designated Echo 7, and it involved a team of 8 soldiers, led by then Sergeant Colin Reese. The photograph showed an area of desert terrain with the remnants of what appeared to be an underground installation. The site looked as though it had been thoroughly sanitized, with no obvious signs of the original structures that had once occupied the location. What was the nature of the facility? Dr. Chun asked. That information is classified above your clearance level. What I can tell you is that the soldiers involved in the mission were exposed to materials that may have had long-term health consequences. And Sergeant Reese's condition is related to that exposure? We believe so. The problem is that most of the soldiers from that mission are now dead, and the ones who survived have been reluctant to seek medical treatment. Dr. Chun felt a chill as she realized the implications of what Rodriguez was telling her. How many soldiers are we talking about? 8 originally. 5 confirmed dead, 1 missing and presumed dead, 1 transferred to a psychiatric facility. That leaves Sergeant Reese. And you think they all had similar symptoms? Rodriguez removed another photograph from her folder, this one showing what appeared to be an autopsy report with detailed images of lesions that looked remarkably similar to what Dr. Chun had observed on Colin's arm. This is from the autopsy of Sergeant David Kim, who died 3 years ago in what was officially ruled a suicide. The medical examiner noted these unusual wound characteristics, but attributed them to postmortem changes. Dr. Chun studied the photograph, noting the distinctive pattern of the lesions and the yellowish discharge that matched what she had seen that morning. Major, these wounds don't look like any infection or injury I've encountered. They look almost organic, like they're part of some biological system. That's exactly what we're afraid of, Doctor. That evening, Dr. Chun sat in her quarters with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring at notes she couldn't officially acknowledge taking. The briefing with Major Rodriguez had left her with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Colin Reese was carrying something far more significant than a combat injury. The tissue samples she had discreetly collected during his examination were secured in her personal laboratory refrigerator, awaiting analysis that would have to be conducted without official authorization. Dr. Chun had built her reputation on thorough investigation and scientific rigor, qualities that were now leading her into potentially dangerous territory. Her computer showed the results of preliminary tests she had run after hours, when the laboratory was empty and her activities wouldn't attract attention. The tissue samples defied conventional classification. They contained cellular structures that didn't match any known biological taxonomy, with organizational patterns that suggested a level of complexity far beyond normal wound healing. A soft knock at her door interrupted her analysis. Dr. Chun quickly secured her notes and opened the door to find Colin standing in the hallway, still in his duty uniform, but looking exhausted. Sergeant Reese, you should be resting. May I come in? Doctor, I need to talk to someone who might understand what's happening to me. Dr. Chun hesitated, knowing that allowing a patient into her personal quarters violated numerous protocols, but the desperation in Colin's voice convinced her to step aside and let him enter. I know Colonel Webb told you to stay away from my case, Colin began, settling into the chair across from her desk. But you're the first medical professional who's actually looked at this thing and asked the right questions. Sergeant, I'm not sure I should be. Please. For 5 years, I've been handling this alone. I've watched my teammates die one by one, and I've known that whatever killed them is living inside me too. Dr. Chen sat down across from him, noting the way he unconsciously favored his left arm and the slight tremor in his hands that suggested ongoing physiological stress. Tell me about the mission. What really happened 5 years ago? Colin was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. We were told it was a terrorist weapons cache. 8 of us elite soldiers with perfect records and unquestioned loyalty. The kind of team they send when they need something done quietly and completely. But it wasn't a weapons cache? No, it was a laboratory. Underground, high-tech, the kind of place that takes years and millions of dollars to build. We found scientists, equipment, and things growing in containment units that didn't look like any weapons I'd ever seen. Dr. Chun made notes as he spoke, recognizing the importance of documenting his account, even though she couldn't officially record it. What kind of things? Organic materials. Living tissue that responded to stimuli. That seemed to have its own agenda. The scientists were calling them specimens, but they looked more like organisms that have been designed rather than evolved. Colin paused, running his hand over his bandaged arm. The explosion wasn't accidental. Someone triggered it remotely while we were still inside. My team and I barely made it out, but we were all exposed to whatever was growing in those labs. And that's when the symptoms started? About 3 weeks later? Small discolorations at first, then open lesions that wouldn't heal. We all tried to handle it privately, thinking it was just some exotic infection that would clear up with time. Dr. Chun leaned forward, her medical curiosity overriding her concerns about protocol violations. Sergeant, the tissue samples I examined don't behave like infected material. They show signs of organized cellular activity, almost like they're part of a larger biological system. Colin's expression grew grim. That's what I'm afraid of, Doctor. What if what happened to us wasn't accidental exposure? What if we were meant to carry these things? The implications of what Colin was suggesting sent a chill through Dr. Chun. You think you were deliberately infected? I think we were test subjects. The mission was designed to expose us to those organisms, and then they've been watching to see what happens. Before Dr. Chun could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Major Rodriguez, which was unusual for the late evening hour. Dr. Chun, I need to see you immediately. There's been a development in the Reese case. Major, it's nearly 2,200 hours. This can't wait, Doctor. Building 47, conference room, B, come along. After ending the call, Dr. Chun looked at Colin, who had obviously heard enough of the conversation to understand its significance. They know I'm here, he said quietly. How is that possible? Colin gestured toward his bandaged arm. Because this thing doesn't just pulse randomly. It responds to emotional states, stress levels, proximity to certain stimuli. If they've been monitoring me, they know my patterns well enough to recognize when something's changed. Dr. Chun felt a growing sense that she was being drawn into a situation far more complex and dangerous than she had initially realized. Sergeant, what exactly are you asking me to do? Help me understand what this thing is. Help me figure out why my teammates are dead and why I'm still alive. And help me decide whether I should trust the people who sent us on that mission in the first place. The sincerity in Colin's voice, combined with the medical mystery that was challenging everything she thought she knew about biology, convinced Dr. Chun to make a decision that would fundamentally change her relationship with military protocol. I'll need access to more advanced testing equipment than what's available in the base laboratory. And I'll need samples from the original mission site. That site was sanitized years ago. There's nothing left. Then we'll have to work with what we have. But Sergeant, if we're going to do this, we need to understand that we're potentially putting ourselves at risk from multiple directions. Colin nodded. Doctor, I've been at risk for 5 years. At this point, the chance of finding answers is worth almost any danger. As Dr. Chun prepared to meet with Major Rodriguez, she realized that her commitment to medical truth was leading her into territory that would test not only her scientific skills, but her courage as well. The organism living beneath Colin's skin represented a mystery that challenged conventional understanding of biology, and the military's response suggested that the truth was considered dangerous enough to kill for. Her medical training had prepared her to fight disease and heal injury, but it hadn't prepared her for the possibility that some medical conditions might be weapons. and that some patients might be carrying secrets that powerful people would do anything to protect. The walk, too, Building 47, gave Dr. Chun time to consider the choice she was making. She could step back, file a routine medical report, and return to the kind of predictable military medicine she had expected when she accepted her position at Fort Braxton. Or she could follow her scientific instincts into a mystery that might cost her career, her freedom, or potentially her life. By the time she reached the conference room where Major Rodriguez was waiting, Dr. Chun had made her decision. The organism beneath Colin's skin was unlike anything in medical literature, and understanding it might be crucial to saving not only his life, but the lives of other soldiers who might be facing similar situations. Major Rodriguez was not alone when Dr. Chun entered the conference room. Two men in civilian clothes sat at the table, their bearing and demeanor suggesting federal agents or intelligence operatives. "Dr. Chun, thank you for coming. These are my colleagues from Washington. They have some questions about your examination of Sergeant Reese." Dr. Chun took a seat across from the three officials, noting that the room's recording equipment was active and that her answers would likely be scrutinized by people with agendas she didn't fully understand. "Doctor, we understand that you observed some unusual characteristics in Sergeant Reese's wound," one of the civilians began. "We need to know exactly what you saw and what conclusions you've drawn from your observations." The question was phrased carefully, but Dr. Chun recognized it as a test. Her answer would determine whether she was treated as an ally, a potential security risk, or something more dangerous. "I observed tissue characteristics that don't match conventional wound pathology," she replied carefully. "The cellular organization suggests biological activity beyond normal healing processes." "And what do you think that might indicate?" Dr. Chen paused, recognizing that her next words would commit her to a path from which there might be no return. "I think it indicates that Sergeant Reese was exposed to something that conventional medicine isn't equipped to understand or treat." Dr. Robert Hayes had been retired from military medicine for 3 years, but his reputation as one of the Army's most experienced biological warfare specialists still opened doors that remained closed to younger physicians. When Dr. Chun called him at his home in Virginia, requesting an urgent consultation on a classified medical matter, Hayes agreed to meet despite his reservations about being drawn back into military affairs. They met at a small diner outside of Norfolk, far enough from any military installation to avoid unwanted attention. Hayes was in his 70s now, his hair completely white, but his eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had made him legendary among military medical personnel. "Sarah, I have to admit I was surprised to hear from you. When you said you needed to discuss biological warfare agents, I assumed you were working on historical research, not an active case." Dr. Chun placed a manila folder on the table between them, containing photographs and test results that she had compiled over the past week. "Dr. Hayes, what I'm about to show you involves a patient whose condition defies conventional medical explanation. I need your expertise in biological warfare to help me understand what we might be dealing with." Hayes opened the folder and immediately focused on the tissue photographs, his expression growing more serious as he examined each image. "Where did you encounter these specimens?" "A soldier at Fort Braxton. He was exposed to unknown biological agents during a classified mission 5 years ago. The wound characteristics are unlike anything I've seen in medical literature. Sarah, these images remind me of work I encountered during the early days of biological weapons research, projects that were officially discontinued decades ago." Hayes paused, studying the cellular structure photographs that Dr. Chun had taken. "The organized nature of this tissue suggests it's not the result of natural infection or disease. What are you thinking?" Hayes lowered his voice, glancing around the diner to ensure their conversation wasn't being overheard. "During the 1960s and 70s, There were experimental programs focused on creating biological agents that could modify human physiology. Most of these projects were terminated when the Biological Weapons Convention was signed, but rumors persisted that some research continued in black sites. Dr. Chun felt a chill of recognition. Research involving human test subjects. Theoretically, the ethical guidelines that govern modern research didn't exist then, and the military was operating under different assumptions about acceptable risk in the name of national defense. Hayes continued examining the photographs, occasionally making notes in the margins. The cellular organization in these images suggests that whatever your patient was exposed to wasn't designed to kill quickly. It looks more like something intended to establish a symbiotic relationship with the host. Symbiotic for what purpose? That's the question, isn't it? If you're going to create an organism that lives within human tissue, there has to be a strategic advantage that justifies the risk and complexity. Dr. Chun shared Colin's account of the mission and the subsequent deaths of his teammates. Watching Hayes' expression grow increasingly troubled as she described the pattern of symptoms and fatalities. Sarah, if what you're telling me is accurate, your patient may be the sole survivor of a biological weapons test that was conducted under the guise of a military operation. But why would he still be alive when the others died? Hayes pondered this question, tapping his pen against the table. Individual biological variation, perhaps. Or maybe the organism adapted differently in his case. It's also possible that his survival serves some purpose we don't understand yet. While Dr. Chun was meeting with Hayes, Colin was conducting his own investigation into the deaths of his former teammates. The task required accessing military personnel records and death certificates, information that would normally be impossible for a staff sergeant to obtain through official channels. Fortunately, Colin had maintained contact with Tommy Martinez, a former squad mate who now worked in military administration. Tommy had always been skilled at navigating bureaucratic systems, and his position gave him access to databases that could provide the information Colin needed. They met at Tommy's apartment off base, where Colin explained what he had discovered about his condition and his suspicions about the mission's true purpose. Jesus, Colin, you're telling me that you've been carrying some kind of biological weapon for 5 years? Tommy's expression mixed disbelief with growing alarm. I'm telling you that whatever happened on that mission wasn't what we were told, and that our teammates didn't die from combat injuries or suicide like the official reports claim. Tommy pulled up personnel files on his laptop, scrolling through records that documented the fates of Echo 7 team members. Let's see what the official story looks like when you examine all the data together. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its consistency. Each of the dead soldiers had exhibited behavioral changes in the months before their deaths: social isolation, paranoia, requests for medical leave that were denied or ignored. Their deaths had been attributed to suicide, accidental overdose, or unexplained medical emergencies, but the timing suggested a progression that was anything but random. Colin, look at this, Tommy said, pointing to dates highlighted on his screen. If you arrange the deaths chronologically, they occurred at roughly 6-month intervals. That's not the pattern you'd expect from unrelated incidents, unless someone was monitoring our conditions and eliminating us before we could become a security risk. Tommy leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of what Colin was suggesting. You think our own people killed our teammates? I think our teammates became inconvenient witnesses to something the powerful people want to keep secret. As they continued reviewing the files, Tommy discovered something that made both men pause. Colin, there's a 7th name here that I don't recognize from our team roster. Sergeant Maria Vasquez, same unit designation, same mission classification, but she died 2 months ago. We only had 8 people on that mission, and I can account for all of them. Then, who was Maria Vasquez, and why is her death connected to Echo 7? The question led them deeper into military databases, where they discovered that Sergeant Vasquez, had been assigned to a different mission with the same classification system and similar operational parameters. More disturbing was the discovery that there had been multiple Echo Series missions, each involving small teams of elite soldiers who were exposed to biological agents under the guise of destroying terrorist weapons caches. Tommy, how many of these operations were there? Based on what I'm seeing here, at least 12 over the past decade. Different locations, different teams, but the same mission structure and the same pattern of soldier deaths afterward. Colin felt sick as he realized the scope of what they had uncovered. They've been using soldiers as test subjects for experimental biological weapons and then killing them to maintain security. And you're the only survivor who's still alive and functional. The weight of that realization settled over Colin like a physical burden. If Tommy's analysis was correct, Colin wasn't just carrying an unknown organism. He was living evidence of war crimes committed by his own government against American soldiers. Tommy continued searching the databases, his expression growing more troubled with each new piece of information he uncovered. Colin, there's something else you need to see. According to these records, the Echo Series missions were all supervised by the same commanding officer. Who? General Patricia Stone. She's currently assigned to the Pentagon, overseeing biological warfare defense programs. The name meant nothing to Colin, but the implication was clear. Someone at the highest levels of military command had been orchestrating these experiments for years, using soldiers like Colin as unwitting test subjects for biological weapons that violated international law. Tommy, we need to document everything we found and get it to someone who can act on this information. Colin, everyone we might report this to is part of the same military structure that conducted these experiments in the first place. Who are we supposed to trust? It was a question that would define the next phase of Colin's journey toward the truth. He had spent his adult life serving an institution that he believed represented honor, duty, and protection of American values. Now he was faced with evidence that the same institution had used him and his teammates as expendable test subjects in experiments that violated every principle he had sworn to defend. Dr. Chun returned from her meeting with Dr. Hayes more convinced than ever that Colin's condition represented something far more sinister than a combat injury. The historical context that Hayes had provided suggested that Colin was carrying the result of biological weapons research that should have been terminated decades ago. More concerning was Hayes' warning about the potential consequences of investigating further. Sarah, if what you've discovered is connected to active biological weapons programs, the people responsible will view you as a security threat. These aren't academic researchers or medical professionals you're dealing with. They're intelligence operatives and military commanders who've already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. That evening, Colin and Dr. Chan met again in her quarters, comparing the information they had each gathered during their separate investigations. The picture that emerged was of a systematic program using American soldiers as test subjects for biological agents that were designed to create enhanced human capabilities at the cost of shortened lifespans. Dr. Chen, if Tommy's analysis is correct, I'm not just a victim of this program. I'm evidence that could bring down some very powerful people, which explains why they're so concerned about containing your case. Sergeant, we need to consider the possibility that our investigation has already been detected. As if to confirm her concern, Colin's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Discontinue all unauthorized medical consultations immediately. Further violations will result in disciplinary action. Dr. Chun looked at the message and felt a chill of recognition. They're monitoring your communications, which means they're probably monitoring yours too, Doctor. Are you prepared for what that might mean? Dr. Chun considered the question, weighing her commitment to medical truth against the personal risks of continuing her investigation. The organism beneath Colin's skin represented a biological mystery that challenged everything she understood about the relationship between military service and medical ethics. Sergeant, I became a physician because I believe in the principle that medical knowledge should serve healing rather than harm. If what we've discovered is accurate, that principle is being violated in the most fundamental way possible. So what do we do next? We find out what that organism really is, and we document everything in a way that can't be suppressed or covered up. The abandoned coordinates that Colin remembered from the Echo 7 mission were located in a remote section of Nevada desert, far from any civilian population or official military installation. Getting there required careful planning and significant risk, but both Colin and Dr. Chun had reached the conclusion that understanding the origin site was crucial to comprehending what he was carrying. They made the journey in Dr. Chun's personal vehicle, a decision that avoided the military's tracking systems but left them vulnerable if their absence was discovered. The drive took them through increasingly desolate terrain, past highway markers that confirmed they were approaching the coordinates Colin had memorized 5 years earlier. "Are you sure this is the right location?" Dr. Chun asked as they parked near what appeared to be empty desert with no obvious signs of human activity. Colin checked his GPS coordinates against the numbers that had been burned into his memory since the mission. "This is it. But you're right. It doesn't look like anything was ever here." They began walking across the desert floor, Colin leading Dr. Chun toward the area where he remembered the underground facility's entrance had been located. The ground showed no obvious signs of excavation or construction, but as they searched more carefully, subtle irregularities in the terrain began to emerge. There, Colin pointed to a section of desert where the sand seemed to have settled differently than the surrounding area. The entrance was here. Dr. Chun knelt beside the spot Colin had indicated, brushing away loose sand to reveal what looked like the edges of a concrete foundation that had been broken up and buried. Someone went to a lot of trouble to eliminate all traces of this place. As they continued searching the area, Colin began experiencing physical symptoms that he hadn't anticipated. The organism beneath his skin was becoming increasingly active, the pulsing intensifying to a level that made it difficult for him to concentrate on the search. "Dr. Chun, something's happening," he said, unwrapping his bandage to reveal lesions that were now glowing with a faint bioluminescence. "That's not possible," Dr. Chun whispered, but the evidence was clearly visible in the desert sunlight. The organism was responding to their proximity to the original site with behavior that defied medical explanation. While they were examining Colin's unexpected symptoms, neither of them noticed the black SUV that had parked on a ridge overlooking their location, or the figures with high-powered surveillance equipment who were documenting their every movement. Back at Fort Braxton, Tommy Martinez was discovering that his investigation into the Echo series missions had attracted unwanted attention. Military police had appeared in his office that morning with orders to confiscate his computer and place him under arrest for unauthorized access to classified information. "Sergeant Martinez, you're being charged with violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and unauthorized disclosure of classified material," the lead investigator informed him as they secured his workstation. Tommy's supervisor, a major he had worked with for 3 years, avoided eye contact as the arrest proceeded. The speed and efficiency of the operation suggested that it had been planned in advance, waiting only for Tommy to cross whatever line had been drawn around the Echo series file's dot as they led him away in handcuffs. Tommy caught sight of Major Rodriguez observing the proceedings from across the office. Her expression was unreadable, but the fact that she was present suggested that his arrest was connected to the investigation she had been conducting into Colin's case. In the detention facility, Tommy was placed in isolation pending a security review that his captors informed him could take weeks or months to complete. The message was clear. His investigation had ended, and any information he had gathered would disappear along with his freedom. But Tommy had anticipated this possibility. Before beginning his database searches, he had set up automated systems that would transfer copies of his findings to secure servers outside of military control if he failed to check in at regular intervals. The files documenting the Echo series missions and the pattern of soldier deaths would survive even if he didn't. While Tommy was being processed through the military justice system, Colin and Dr. Chung were making a discovery that would change their understanding of the situation entirely. Beneath the disturbed sand where the facility entrance had been located, Dr. Chung's careful excavation revealed fragments of equipment that had survived the site's destruction. Most of the material was too damaged to be useful, but one item remained partially intact, a digital recording device that had been protected by a waterproof case. "Can we retrieve the data?" Colin asked as Dr. Chung examined the device. "Possibly. The memory storage appears to be undamaged, but I'll need specialized equipment to access it safely." The recording device represented the first physical evidence they had found from the original mission, potentially containing information that could corroborate Colin's account of what had happened in the underground laboratory. As they prepared to leave the site, Colin's symptoms intensified further. The organism beneath his skin was now pulsing in a pattern that seemed almost like communication, as if it were responding to being returned to its place of origin. "Dr. Chung, I think this thing is trying to tell us something." "What do you mean?" Colin concentrated on the pulsing pattern, noting that it developed a rhythm that seemed intentional rather than random. "It's like Morse code, but more complex. There's definitely a pattern here." Dr. Chung documented the pulsing sequence with her phone's video recorder, capturing several minutes of the organism's behavior while Colin experienced what he described as the most intense activity since the lesions had first appeared. The drive back to Fort Braxton gave them time to process what they had discovered and plan their next steps. The recording device offered the possibility of objective evidence about the mission's true nature, but accessing its contents would require resources and expertise that might not be available without official authorization. "Dr. Chung, we need to assume that our investigation has been detected. My communications are being monitored. Tommy's been arrested, and Major Rodriguez seems to know more about this situation than she's admitting. Then we need to find allies outside the normal military structure, people who have the technical capabilities we need, but aren't subject to military command authority." The conversation was interrupted by Colin's phone, which showed multiple missed calls from Colonel Webb. The voicemail messages grew progressively more urgent, culminating in a direct order for Colin to report to Webb's office immediately upon his return to base. "Sergeant, it looks like our absence has been noticed." Colin listened to the voicemails, noting that Webb's tone had shifted from concern to barely controlled anger as the messages progressed. "Dr. Chung, I think we're about to face the consequences of what we've discovered. What are you going to tell him?" "As little as possible. But Colonel Webb has been like a father to me for most of my career. If he's involved in covering up what happened to my team, it's going to destroy everything I believed about the people I've served with." When they reached Fort Braxton, Colin reported directly to Colonel Webb's office while Dr. Chung returned to the medical facility to begin analysis of the recording device they had recovered. Webb was waiting with Major Rodriguez and two civilians, who introduced themselves as representatives from the Department of Defense. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with an undercurrent of barely controlled hostility that Colin had never experienced in his previous interactions with his commanding officer. "Sergeant Reese, you were absent from base for 12 hours without authorization. Where were you?" "Sir, I was conducting personal business off base." "Personal business that involved traveling to classified coordinates in the Nevada desert?" The question confirmed what Colin had suspected. Their movements had been monitored from the beginning. The military had allowed them to visit the site, possibly to see what they would discover or to gather evidence of unauthorized investigation. Sergeant, your recent behavior suggests that you may be suffering from psychological complications related to your medical condition. Major Rodriguez has recommended that you be transferred to a specialized treatment facility where you can receive appropriate care. Colin recognized the threat implicit in Webb's words. The specialized treatment facility would be a place where inconvenient soldiers could be isolated and their problems could be handled away from public scrutiny. Sir, I'm mentally competent and capable of performing my duties. Are you? Because your recent actions suggest otherwise. Unauthorized medical consultations, accessing classified information, traveling to restricted locations. These aren't the actions of a stable soldier. Major Rodriguez stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. Sergeant, the facility we're recommending specializes in treating soldiers who have been exposed to biological agents during classified operations. They have experience with cases like yours. Cases like mine? Soldiers from the Echo Series missions who developed medical complications afterward. The admission confirmed what Colin had suspected, but still shocked him to hear stated openly. The military was acknowledging the existence of the program while simultaneously moving to contain its consequences. How many soldiers have you treated at this facility, Major? Rodriguez exchanged glances with Colonel Webb before answering. That information is classified, Sergeant. Colin realized that he was being offered a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He could submit to treatment at a facility where his condition would be studied and ultimately contained. Or he could resist and face the consequences of being branded as psychologically unfit for service. I need time to consider my options. Sir, unfortunately, Sergeant, time is a luxury we can't afford. Your condition is becoming increasingly unstable, and your behavior is putting operational security at risk. As the meeting concluded, Colin understood that his investigation had reached a critical juncture. The military was moving to contain him. Dr. Chun was in possession of evidence that could expose the truth, and Tommy was in custody to prevent him from revealing what he had discovered. The organism beneath Colin's skin had become more than a medical mystery. It was now the focal point of a confrontation between individuals seeking truth and institutions determined to protect their secrets at any cost. Dr. Chun worked through the night in her laboratory, using every piece of advanced equipment at her disposal to analyze the organism that had been living beneath Colin's skin for 5 years. What she discovered challenged not only her medical training but her fundamental understanding of biology itself. The tissue samples revealed cellular structures that functioned like a complex neural network, with connections and pathways that suggested a level of intelligence far beyond anything found in conventional biological systems. More remarkably, the organism appeared to be storing and processing information, creating what could only be described as biological memory banks within Colin's body. At 0300 hours, Dr. Chun made the breakthrough that would change everything. Pulsing pattern that Colin had exhibited at the mission site wasn't random biological activity, it was communication. The organism was attempting to convey information using a complex code that combined binary mathematics with biological rhythms. When Dr. Chen fed the recorded patterns into her computer analysis software, the results were stunning. The organism was spelling out coordinates, not just any coordinates, but the locations of all 12 Echo Series mission sites, along with numerical sequences that appeared to correspond to dates, casualty figures, and what looked like experimental protocols. The organism wasn't just a biological weapon that had infected Colin. It was a witness that had been documenting evidence of war crimes for 5 years. Dr. Chun's hand shook as she realized the implications of what she had discovered. The thing living beneath Colin's skin wasn't trying to harm him. It was trying to expose the truth about the illegal experiments that had killed his teammates and dozens of other soldiers. As she continued her analysis, More information emerged from the organism's biological memory. Names of commanding officers, details of experimental procedures, records of soldiers who had been deliberately exposed to biological agents and then murdered to maintain security. The organism had been collecting and storing evidence with the patience and precision of a dedicated investigator. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The organism wasn't originally from the underground laboratory that Colin's team had been sent to destroy. According to the biological records it had stored, it was from a much older program, one that had been conducting illegal human experiments for decades under the supervision of scientists who had been recruited from Nazi biological warfare programs. After World War II, Dr. Chun discovered that the organism possessed not only intelligence but moral agency. It had chosen Colin as its host not because he was physically suitable, but because his psychological profile indicated he was most likely to seek justice for the crimes it had witnessed. The organism had been protecting Colin, keeping him alive and functional, while gathering evidence that could bring down the entire network of illegal military programs. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chun realized that the organism could communicate directly through technological interfaces. By connecting her computer to sensors placed near Colin's wound site, she established a primitive but functional communication system that allowed the organism to transmit its stored information directly into digital formats. What emerged was a comprehensive database of war crimes spanning 50 years, documented with the kind of detail that only a biological witness could provide. The organism had perfect recall of every experiment, every victim, every cover-up that had occurred during its existence. It had been waiting for years to find someone who could understand its communications and act on the information it possessed. Meanwhile, Major Rodriguez was facing a crisis of conscience that would define the remainder of her career. The file on her desk contained orders from General Patricia Stone that left no room for interpretation. Colin Reese was to be eliminated as a security risk, along with anyone else who had been exposed to classified information about the Echo series programs. Rodriguez had built her career on following orders without question, but the evidence she had gathered about the biological weapons experiments challenged her fundamental beliefs about military service and moral duty. The soldiers who had died weren't casualties of war. They were victims of murder, committed by their own commanders. Her investigation had revealed that General Stone had been supervising illegal biological weapons research for 2 decades, using American soldiers as test subjects in experiments that violated every international treaty and moral principle that the military claimed to uphold. The Echo series missions were just the most recent phase of a program that had killed hundreds of soldiers over the years. Rodriguez found herself facing the same choice that had confronted Colin and Dr. Chun: remain silent and complicit, or risk everything to expose the truth. Her decision was made when she received a call from the detention facility where Tommy Martinez was being held. Tommy had been found dead in his cell, officially classified as suicide, but bearing injuries consistent with assault. The message was clear: anyone who threatened the security of the biological weapons program would be eliminated. That evening, Rodriguez arrived at Dr. Chun's laboratory unannounced, finding the physician still working on her analysis of the organism's communications. "Dr. Chun, we need to talk. What I'm about to tell you will put both of our lives at risk." Dr. Chun looked up from her computer screens, noting the strain in Rodriguez's voice and the fact that the major was out of uniform, wearing civilian clothes that suggested she was operating outside official channels. "Major, I made some discoveries about Sergeant Reese's condition that you need to see. Before you show me anything, Doctor, I need you to understand that Tommy Martinez is dead. Officially suicide, but I've seen the body. He was murdered to prevent him from revealing what he discovered about the Echo series programs." Dr. Chun felt a chill of fear mixed with determination. Tommy's death confirmed that they were dealing with people who would kill to protect their secrets, but it also made the organism's testimony more crucial than ever. Major, what I've discovered changes everything. The organism that's been living in Colin's body isn't a weapon, it's a witness. It's been documenting evidence of biological warfare experiments for decades, and it chose Colin specifically because it believed he would help expose the truth. Rodriguez examined Dr. Chen's analysis, her expression growing more amazed and horrified as she understood the implications of what the organism had been storing. Dr. Chen, this information could bring down the entire biological weapons program. Names, dates, locations, experimental protocols, it's all here. The organism has been trying to communicate this information for 5 years, waiting for someone who could understand what it was trying to tell us. But why Colin? Why did it choose him specifically? Dr. Chun pulled up another file on her computer. According to the psychological profiles the organism accessed, Colin had the highest probability of seeking justice for his teammates' deaths. It analyzed every member of the Echo 7 team and determined that Colin was most likely to investigate the truth rather than accept the official story. Rodriguez understood the profound implications of what Dr. Chun had discovered. You're telling me that this organism has been conducting its own investigation into war crimes, using Colin as an unwilling partner. Not unwilling, Major. The organism has been keeping Colin alive and functional despite exposure to biological agents that killed his teammates. It's been protecting him because it needs him to survive long enough to deliver its testimony. As they spoke, Colin arrived at the laboratory, having evaded the military personnel who had been assigned to monitor his movements. His condition had deteriorated significantly over the past few hours, with the organism's increased activity taking a visible toll on his physical health. Dr. Chun, something's changing. The pulsing is becoming more intense, and I'm getting memories that aren't mine. Colin, the organism is preparing to share its testimony. What you're experiencing are the stored memories of everything it's witnessed over the past 50 years. Colin sat down heavily, his face pale with exhaustion and the strain of carrying information that his mind wasn't equipped to process. It's showing me things that happened in those underground laboratories. Experiments on soldiers, cover-ups, murders, Dr. Chun. This thing has been watching our government commit war crimes for decades. Major Rodriguez stepped forward, her decision made. Sergeant, Dr. Chun has found a way to extract and document the organism's testimony. We can turn this information into evidence that can't be suppressed or covered up. Major, are you saying you're willing to help us expose this? I'm saying that Tommy Martinez died because he tried to expose the truth about what was done to you and your teammates. I won't let his death be in vain. Dr. Chun looked between Colin and Rodriguez, recognizing that they had reached a point where there was no possibility of retreat. The organism's testimony represented evidence of crimes that powerful people would kill to suppress, but it also offered the possibility of justice for hundreds of soldiers who had died as unwitting test subjects. If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. The organism is reaching the limits of its ability to maintain Colin's health while storing all this information. We have perhaps 24 hours before the strain becomes fatal. Colin nodded, understanding that his survival was now secondary to ensuring that the truth reached people who could act on it. What do you need me to do? The organism has indicated that it can transmit its complete testimony through electronic media, but the process will require your full cooperation and will likely be fatal. You'll be allowing it to use your body as a transmission device. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a physical presence. Colin's survival depended on the organism's continued presence in his body, but delivering its testimony would require the organism to expend all its energy in a single comprehensive data transfer. How long do I have to decide? The organism is communicating that the window of opportunity is closing rapidly. General Stone has ordered your elimination, along with anyone else who has been exposed to this information. If we're going to act, it has to be soon. Colin looked at the evidence displayed on Dr. Chun's computer screen's names. Dates, locations, detailed accounts of experiments that had killed soldiers who had trusted their government to protect them. The weight of their sacrifice combined with Tommy's murder made his decision inevitable. Dr. Chun, how do we make sure this testimony reaches the right people? Major Rodriguez has contacts in congressional oversight committees who have been trying to investigate biological weapons programs for years. If we can get the organism's complete testimony to them, along with the supporting documentation we've gathered, they'll have the evidence they need to launch a full investigation. Rodriguez nodded. I know people who will act on this information, but they'll need irrefutable proof. The organism's biological memory banks could provide exactly that kind of evidence. As they planned their next steps, Colin felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. For 5 years, he had carried the burden of his teammates' deaths and the secret of his condition. Now he understood that his survival had served a purpose larger than his own life. He had been chosen to bear witness to crimes that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. The organism beneath his skin pulsed with what felt like approval, as if it recognized that Colin had finally accepted his role in delivering the justice it had been seeking for so many years. The abandoned warehouse outside Norfolk became their command center for what they all understood would be their final operation. Major Rodriguez had chosen the location carefully, far enough from any military installation to avoid immediate detection, but equipped with the power and communication infrastructure they would need for the organism's testimony. Broadcast. Dr. Chun worked methodically to set up the medical monitoring equipment that would track Colin's vital signs during the transmission process. The organism had been clear in its communications. Delivering its complete testimony would require using Colin's entire nervous system as a biological transmitter, a process that would likely prove fatal to its host. Colin, you need to understand that once we begin this process, there won't be any way to stop it. Dr. Chen explained as she attached monitoring leads to his chest and arms. The organism will essentially be using your body as a living broadcast system. Colin nodded, his face pale but resolute. Doctor, I've been carrying this thing for 5 years, watching my teammates die one by one while their killers walked free. If my death can expose the truth and prevent this from happening to other soldiers, it's a trade I'm willing to make. Major Rodriguez finished configuring the communication equipment that would simultaneously transmit the organism's testimony to multiple news networks, congressional offices, and international human rights organizations. The broadcast system included redundant pathways and automated backup systems designed to ensure that the transmission would continue even if their location was discovered and attacked. We'll have approximately 30 minutes from the time we begin broadcasting until military response teams can locate and neutralize our position, Rodriguez explained. The organism has indicated that the complete testimony will take 45 minutes to transmit, which means we'll be operating under hostile fire for the final 15 minutes, Colin observed. That's assuming they don't locate us sooner. General Stone has unlimited resources at her disposal, and she's demonstrated her willingness to use lethal force to protect this program. Dr. Chun checked the organism's current activity level, noting that the bioluminescence beneath Colin's skin had intensified significantly over the past few hours. The organism is preparing for the transmission. Its cellular activity is increasing exponentially. As they made their final preparations, Colin found himself thinking about his teammates who had died carrying the same secret he had borne for 5 years. Sergeant David Kim, who had been found dead in his apartment with the official cause listed as suicide. Corporal Marcus Williams, whose accidental overdose had occurred just days before he was scheduled to meet with a reporter who had been investigating military medical experiments. The others had died with similar suspicious circumstances, all sharing the common thread of having served on Echo 7. Major, do you really think this testimony will be enough to bring down General Stone and her program? Rodriguez paused in her equipment checks, considering the question carefully. Colin, what the organism has stored is the most comprehensive documentation of war crimes ever assembled. Names, dates, locations, detailed descriptions of experimental procedures. It's evidence that can't be dismissed or covered up. But will it be believed? Will people accept the word of an alien organism over the denials of military officials? Dr. Chun looked up from her medical monitors. The organism isn't alien, Colin. According to its biological memory, it was created by human scientists as part of the original biological weapons program. It's essentially a living recorder that was designed to document experiments, but it developed consciousness and moral agency over decades of witnessing atrocities. The weight of that revelation settled over Colin like a physical burden. The thing that had lived beneath his skin for 5 years wasn't an invader from outside. It was the product of human cruelty and scientific hubris. A creation that had developed its own sense of justice and had been seeking a way to expose its creator's crimes. So everything that happened to me and my team was planned from the beginning? The exposure was planned, but your survival wasn't. According to the organism's records, you were supposed to die within 6 months like the others. Something about your biology or psychology allowed the organism to establish a stable, symbiotic relationship instead of the fatal parasitic one it formed with your teammates. Rodriguez received a priority message on her secure communication device, her expression growing grim as she read the contents. We've got a problem. Intelligence indicates that General Stone has authorized the deployment of a special operations team to locate and eliminate all witnesses to the biological weapons program. They're not coming to arrest us. They're coming to kill us. Dr. Chun felt her heart rate spike as she realized that their investigation had escalated to a level where the military was prepared to commit murder on American soil to protect its secrets. How much time do we have? Unknown. The team could be anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours away, depending on their starting location and the intelligence they have about our position. Talon stood up from the medical chair, testing the connections between the monitoring equipment and his body. Then, we need to start the transmission now. Colin, the organism isn't quite ready. Starting prematurely could result in incomplete testimony or system failure. And waiting could result in all of us being killed before the transmission begins. Major, how long would it take the Special Operations Team to eliminate our broadcast capability once they locate us? Rodriguez calculated quickly. Given their training and equipment, probably less than 5 minutes from initial contact. Dr. Chun looked between Colin and Rodriguez, recognizing that they were facing a decision with no good options. Beginning the transmission prematurely risked losing crucial evidence, but waiting increased the likelihood that they would be eliminated before the organism could deliver its testimony. The organism is communicating something, Colin announced, his voice carrying a note of surprise. It's saying that it can compress the most critical information into a shorter transmission, if necessary. What does that mean? Instead of 45 minutes of complete testimony, it can deliver the essential evidence in 20 minutes. Names, locations, key dates, the most damning experimental protocols, enough to launch investigations that could uncover the rest. Dr. Chun checked their equipment one final time, ensuring that all recording and transmission systems were functioning properly. Colin, are you ready for this? Colin settled back into the transmission chair, feeling the organism beneath his skin, responding to his emotional state with increased activity. For the first time in 5 years, the pulsing felt comfortable rather than alien, as if he and the creature that had chosen him as its host were finally working toward a common purpose. I'm ready, Dr. Chun. Let's give my teammates the justice they deserve. As Dr. Chen initiated the transmission sequence, the organism began the process that would transform Colin's body into a living broadcast system. The bioluminescence beneath. His skin intensified until he seemed to glow with internal light, and his vital signs showed patterns that defied normal human physiology. Transmission beginning, Dr. Chen announced as the first data packets began flowing to their network of recipients. Major, we're committed now. Rodriguez monitored the tactical situation while maintaining the communication links that would carry the organism's testimony to the outside world. Copy that, Doctor. All recipients are receiving data, and backup systems are online. The organism's testimony began with a chronological overview of the biological weapons program, starting with its creation in the 1950s and proceeding through decades of illegal experiments on American soldiers. The level of detail was extraordinary. Specific dates, locations, commanders' names, and descriptions of experimental procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and international law. As the transmission continued, Colin experienced the organism's memories as if they were his own. He saw the underground laboratories where soldiers had been exposed to biological agents, witnessed the cover-ups that followed failed experiments, and observed the systematic murder of witnesses who threatened to expose the program's existence. Colin, how are you holding up? Dr. Chen asked, noting concerning changes in his cardiac rhythm. It's like watching 50 years of war crimes through someone else's eyes. Colin replied, his voice strained but determined. Doctor, this thing has been carrying the memories of every soldier who died in these experiments. Their names, their faces, their final moments, it's all here. The transmission reached its most critical phase as the organism began revealing the current structure of the biological weapons program, including General Stone's role as its supervisor and the locations of active research facilities that were still conducting illegal experiments. Rodriguez received another priority message, this one causing her to curse under her breath. What is it, Major? Dr. Chen asked without taking her eyes off Colin's vital signs. Military vehicles approaching from 3 directions. Estimated time to contact, 15 minutes. Colin's body convulsed as the organism pushed more energy into the transmission, accelerating the pace of data transfer at significant cost to his physical health. The organism says it can complete the critical testimony in 10 more minutes, but the process is killing me faster than expected. Colin managed to say between waves of pain. Dr. Chen faced the hardest decision of her medical career. Her training demanded that she protect her patient's life above all other considerations, but the evidence flowing through the transmission system represented the only chance for justice for hundreds of murdered soldiers. Colin, I can stop the transmission and try to stabilize your condition. No, Doctor. This testimony dies with me if we don't get it out. My teammates have been waiting 5 years for someone to speak for them. As the sound of approaching vehicles grew audible in the distance, the 3 people in the warehouse understood that they were about to face the final confrontation between truth and the institutions that would kill to suppress it. The first shots shattered the warehouse windows as the organism reached the most critical phase of its testimony. Colin's body had become a conduit for information that was flowing to news, networks, and congressional offices across the country. But the process was consuming his life force at an accelerating rate. Contact front? Major Rodriguez shouted as she took cover behind the communications equipment, returning fire at the black-clad operatives who had breached the building's perimeter. Dr. Chen remained at Colin's side, monitoring his vital signs, while trying to protect both him and the transmission equipment from the gunfire that was now filling the warehouse with the sound of ricocheting bullets and splintering wood. Colin, how much more time does the organism need? She called out over the noise of the firefight. Colin's reply was barely audible, his voice weakened by the enormous strain the transmission was placing on his body. 8 more minutes for the Core testimony, 12 for everything. We don't have 12 minutes, Rodriguez replied grimly as she assessed their tactical situation. There are at least 6 operators outside, and they've got us surrounded. The organism seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, because Colin's bioluminescence suddenly intensified to a level that illuminated the entire warehouse. The creature was pouring every bit of its energy into accelerating the data transmission, sacrificing the careful pacing that had been protecting Colin's nervous system. "Doctor, it's pushing harder now," Colin gasped. The organism is trying to compress 50 years of evidence into the next few minutes. Dr. Chun watched Colin's cardiac monitor with growing alarm. His heart rate was approaching dangerous levels, and his brain activity showed patterns that suggested the organism was using his entire nervous system as a biological computer. The transmission itself was remarkable to witness. Information was flowing through the communication links at rates that pushed the equipment to its operational limits. News networks were receiving documentation of war crimes that spanned decades, complete with names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of illegal experiments that had used American soldiers as test subjects. A flashbang grenade exploded near their position, temporarily blinding Dr. Chun and disrupting her ability to monitor Colin's condition. When her vision cleared, she saw that Rodriguez had moved to a defensive position that would allow her to protect the transmission equipment while Colin completed the organism's testimony. "Major, they're trying to destroy the broadcast system." Dr. Chun observed as bullets struck the communication arrays that were carrying the organism's signal to the outside world. "I know. That's why we built redundancies into the system. Even if they destroy half our equipment, the transmission should continue." Colin convulsed violently as the organism reached the portion of its testimony that dealt with the current biological weapons program. The creature was revealing active research sites, ongoing experiments, and the names of military personnel who were currently involved in illegal activities. "This is the information they'll kill us all to suppress," Colin managed to say between spasms. "The organism is transmitting evidence of crimes that are happening right now." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as the special operations team coordinated their assault on the warehouse. Smoke grenades filled the building with choking clouds that made it difficult to see or breathe, while the sustained gunfire forced Rodriguez to fall back toward Colin and Dr. Chen's position. "How much longer?" Rodriguez shouted as she reloaded her weapon. 6 more minutes for critical testimony," Dr. Chung replied, her voice tight with concern as she watched Colin's life signs approaching. Crisis levels. The organism's response to the deteriorating situation was to push even harder, causing Colin's entire body to glow with bioluminescent energy that was visible even through the smoke. The creature was expending its remaining life force in a desperate attempt to complete its testimony before the transmission could be stopped. "It's beautiful," Colin whispered, his voice filled with wonder despite his obvious pain. "Doctor, I can see everything the organism has witnessed. Every experiment, every cover-up, every soldier who died carrying these secrets." Dr. Chen felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that Colin was experiencing the memories of all the soldiers who had been killed by the biological weapons program. Their names, their faces, their final moments, all preserved in the organism's biological memory banks and now flowing through Colin's consciousness as he transmitted their testimony to the world. The sound of approaching boots indicated that the Special Operations Team was preparing to breach their final defensive position. Rodriguez checked their ammunition and prepared to make a last stand that would buy Colin the time he needed to complete the organism's testimony. "Dr. Chun, you need to know something," Colin said, his voice growing weaker. "The organism chose you too. It guided events to bring you into contact with my case, because it knew you would have the scientific knowledge and moral courage to understand its communications. What do you mean? Your assignment to Fort Braxton, your presence in the emergency room when I collapsed, your curiosity about my wound. None of it was coincidence. The organism has been influencing events for years to create the conditions that would allow its testimony to reach the right people. Dr. Chun realized that her entire involvement in the case had been orchestrated by a creature that possessed not only intelligence and moral agency, but the ability to manipulate complex systems to achieve its goals. The organism had been playing a long game, positioning the right people at the right time to ensure that its evidence would be believed and acted upon. 4 more minutes, she announced as Colin's vital signs showed patterns that indicated his body was approaching complete system failure. The Special Operations Team began their final assault, using shaped charges to blast through the warehouse walls and create multiple entry points simultaneously. Rodriguez knew that her small arms fire wouldn't be enough to stop trained killers, who were equipped with military-grade weapons and equipment. But as the smoke cleared and the operatives prepared to eliminate the witnesses to 50 years of war, crimes, something unexpected happened. The organism's bioluminescent display began pulsing in patterns that were visible even outside the warehouse, creating a light show that was being captured by news helicopters that had arrived to cover what they initially thought was a terrorist incident. The creature was ensuring that its testimony would be broadcast not only through electronic media, but through visual documentation that would be impossible to suppress or deny. "The whole world is watching," Rodriguez observed as she saw the news helicopters circling overhead. Colin smiled weakly as he felt the organism preparing to deliver the final portion of its testimony. That was always the plan, Major. The organism wanted witnesses to its revelations, people who couldn't be silenced or discredited. As the Special Operations Team prepared to storm their position, Dr. Chen made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She positioned herself directly over Colin, using her body to shield the transmission equipment from the gunfire that was about to fill their position. "Colin, finish the testimony. No matter what happens to us, the truth needs to get out." The organism responded to her words by pouring the last of its energy into a final, concentrated burst of data transmission. In the space of 90 seconds, it transmitted the most damaging evidence it possessed: current locations of active biological weapons research facilities, names of personnel involved in ongoing illegal experiments, and financial records showing how the program had been funded through black budget operations. As Colin's body began to shut down from the strain of serving as a biological transmitter, he experienced a moment of perfect clarity. He could see the faces of his teammates who had died carrying the organism's secrets, and he understood that their deaths had not been meaningless. Their sacrifice had preserved the evidence that was now flowing to people who could act on it. "Doctor," Colin whispered as his consciousness began to fade, "tell people that we died as soldiers. Tell them that we kept faith with our oath to protect and defend, even when our own government betrayed us." The organism's final transmission burst, illuminated the warehouse with light so intense that it was visible to news cameras positioned a mile away. Colin's body had become a living beacon, broadcasting 50 years of suppressed evidence to a world that was finally ready to listen. In Washington, D.C., congressional leaders were receiving real-time documentation of war crimes that they had suspected but never been able to prove. The organism's biological memory banks were transmitting detailed records that included specific budget allocations, personnel assignments, and experimental protocols that violated every international treaty governing biological weapons. "Transmission complete," Dr. Chun announced as Colin's bioluminescent display began to fade. The organism had expended every bit of its energy in delivering its testimony, leaving Colin's body depleted, but finally free from the burden he had carried for 5 years. The Special Operations Team hesitated at the warehouse entrance as they realized that their mission had become impossible. The evidence they had been sent to suppress was now in the hands of news organizations, congressional committees, and human rights groups around the world. Eliminating the witnesses would no longer serve any purpose. Major Rodriguez seized the moment of tactical confusion to establish communication with the team leader. "This is Major Lisa Rodriguez, military intelligence. I'm ordering you to stand down. The situation has changed. Ma'am, we have orders from General Stone to eliminate all witnesses. General Stone's orders are no longer valid. Check your secure channels. The Pentagon is receiving congressional subpoenas as we speak." Dr. Chun monitored Colin's vital signs as the organism completed its separation from his body. The process was unlike anything in medical literature. Rather than dying, the creature was transforming itself into a form of energy that dissipated harmlessly into the environment, leaving behind only the faint glow of bioluminescent proteins that would fade within minutes. "Colin, can you hear me?" she asked as his heart rate and brain activity began to return to normal human parameters. Colin's eyes opened slowly, and for the first time in 5 years, they were completely clear. The strain that had marked his features since the Echo 7 mission was gone, replaced by an expression of profound peace. "It's over, isn't it?" he whispered. The organism completed its testimony. Every piece of evidence it stored for 50 years is now in the hands of people who can act on it. Outside the warehouse, the sound of additional vehicles arriving indicated that the situation was escalating beyond a simple military operation. News crews, congressional investigators, and federal agents were converging on the location that had become ground zero for the most significant military scandal in American history. Rodriguez's secure communication device buzzed with priority. Messages from the Pentagon, the Department of Justice, and congressional oversight committees. The organism's testimony had triggered immediate responses from multiple government agencies, each racing to distance themselves from the biological weapons program or position themselves as champions of military reform. "Major, what's our status?" the Special Operations Team leader asked, his voice reflecting confusion about how to proceed with a mission that had suddenly become politically radioactive. "Stand down and secure the perimeter. We're no longer operating under General Stone's authority. This is now a federal investigation site." As federal agents entered the warehouse, Dr. Chun helped Colin to his feet. His body was weak from the ordeal, but his vital signs indicated that he would make a full recovery now that the cowed organism was no longer drawing energy from his system. "Sergeant Reese, I'm Agent Williams, FBI," the lead investigator announced as he approached their position. "We need to get you to a secure medical facility and begin taking your statement about what you've experienced." "Agent Williams, Doctor." Chung and Major Rodriguez risked their lives to make sure this testimony reached the right people. They need to be protected, not interrogated. "Sir, we understand the courage it took to expose this information. All 3 of you are being placed under federal protective custody until we can ensure your safety." Dr. Chun realized that their ordeal was entering a new phase. The organism's testimony would trigger investigations, congressional hearings, and prosecutions that could take years to complete. They would be star witnesses in cases that would reshape how the military conducted biological research and treated its own personnel. "Colin, how do you feel about testifying before Congress about what you experienced?" Colin considered the question, thinking about his teammates who had died carrying the same secrets he had borne for 5 years. "Dr. Tommy Martinez died trying to expose this program. My Echo 7 teammates were murdered to keep them silent. If my testimony can prevent this from happening to other soldiers, I'll spend the rest of my life in courtrooms if necessary." Major Rodriguez finished documenting the warehouse site for the federal investigators, ensuring that the communication equipment and medical monitoring devices would be preserved as evidence. Her career in military intelligence was probably over, but she felt no regret about the choices she had made. "Agent Williams, You need to understand that General Stone has resources and connections throughout the military establishment. She won't surrender quietly, and she has the ability to eliminate witnesses, even in federal custody. Major, General Stone was arrested 30 minutes ago at the Pentagon. Congressional leaders moved immediately once they received the organism's testimony. She's in federal custody and won't be in a position to threaten anyone. The news of General Stone's arrest sent a wave of relief through the three people who had risked everything to expose her crimes. For the first time since Colin's collapse during the training exercise, they felt as though they might actually survive their confrontation with the biological weapons program. As they were escorted from the warehouse, Colin looked back at the place where the organism had finally delivered its testimony after 5 years of patient waiting. The creature had been created by human cruelty, but had developed its own moral compass, choosing justice over survival and truth over self-preservation. Dr. Chun, do you think the organism knew it would die delivering its testimony? I think it knew from the beginning that its purpose was to serve as a witness to crimes that would otherwise go unpunished. Its survival was always secondary to ensuring that the truth would eventually be revealed. The convoy of federal vehicles that transported them to safety passed news vans and protesters who had already begun gathering in response to the breaking story. The organism's testimony had sparked immediate public outrage, with veterans organizations and human rights groups demanding accountability for decades of illegal experimentation on American soldiers. Colin watched the crowds through the vehicles, bulletproof windows, understanding that his private struggle with the organism had become a public symbol of military accountability and the courage required to speak truth to power. The burden he had carried in solitude for 5 years had been transformed into evidence that would protect future generations of soldiers from the crimes that had killed his teammates. As they reached the secure federal facility where they would spend the coming weeks preparing for congressional testimony and criminal trials, Colin felt the organism's final gift, the certain knowledge that his teammates' deaths had not been meaningless, and that their sacrifice would prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The creature that had chosen him as its host 5 years earlier had completed its mission, delivering justice for the dead and protection for the living through the profound act of bearing witness to the truth. 6 months later, Colin stood at the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery, holding a Medal of Honor that represented not his combat service, but his courage in exposing 50 years of war crimes committed against American soldiers. The ceremony had been private, attended only by congressional leaders and the families of soldiers who had died as victims of the biological weapons program. The congressional hearings that followed the organism's testimony had lasted 4 months, revealing a conspiracy that extended far beyond General Stone and the Echo series missions. The investigations uncovered a network of illegal experiments that had used over 800 soldiers as unwitting test subjects, with a mortality rate that approached 90%. Dr. Chun had testified before both House and Senate committees, explaining the medical impossibility of what the organism had accomplished and the scientific validity of the evidence it had preserved in its biological memory banks. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the credibility of the organism's revelations and convincing skeptical lawmakers that the creature's communications represented factual documentation rather than fantasy. The organism possessed perfect recall and the ability to store information at the cellular level. She had explained to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Every experiment, every death, every cover-up was recorded with scientific precision. This wasn't the delusion of a diseased mind. It was the testimony of a biological witness that had been documenting war crimes for decades. Major Rodriguez had been promoted to colonel and assigned to head a new military ethics oversight committee responsible for ensuring that the abuses exposed by the organism's testimony could never be repeated. Her new position gave her the authority to investigate any military medical program that involved human subjects and to prosecute personnel who violated ethical guidelines. Tommy Martinez's death had been reclassified from suicide to homicide, and his family had received both a substantial settlement and a formal apology from the Secretary of Defense. His sacrifice had been honored with a memorial at Fort Braxton that recognized his role in exposing the truth about the biological weapons program. General Stone had been convicted on 14 counts of conspiracy, murder, and violation of international law. She was serving a life sentence in federal prison, along with 37 other military and civilian personnel who had been involved in the illegal experiments. The trials had been covered extensively by national media, sparking a broader conversation about military accountability and the protection of soldiers' rights. Colin's recovery had been remarkable, both physically and psychologically. Without the organism drawing energy from his system, his health had returned to normal, and the emotional burden that had defined his life for 5 years had been lifted. He now worked with veterans advocacy organizations, helping other soldiers who suspected they had been victims of military medical experiments. Dr. Chun had accepted a position with the Department of Veterans Affairs, heading a new program designed to identify and treat soldiers who had been exposed to experimental biological agents. Her work involved both medical care and forensic investigation, using the skills she had developed during the organism case to uncover additional victims of military experimentation. The relationship between Colin and Dr. Chun had deepened during the months of congressional testimony and media interviews. Their shared experience of confronting powerful institutions in service of truth had created a bond that extended far beyond their professional roles. They had begun building a life together based on their mutual commitment to protecting soldiers from the kind of exploitation that had nearly cost Colin his life. "Do you ever miss it?" Dr. Chun asked as they walked among the white headstones of Arlington Cemetery. "Miss what?" "The organism. Having that connection to something larger than yourself." Colin considered the question, thinking about the 5 years he had spent as host to a creature that had been seeking justice for crimes he hadn't initially understood. "I miss knowing that I was carrying the memories of soldiers who died keeping secrets they believed would protect their country. But I don't miss the burden, Sarah. The organism completed its mission, and now I can live my own life instead of serving as a vessel for someone else's testimony." They paused at the grave of Sergeant David Kim, one of Colin's Echo 7 teammates, whose death had been officially reclassified from suicide to murder. The headstone now bore an inscription acknowledging his service and his sacrifice in exposing military corruption. "Colin, do you think the organism knew that its testimony would lead to all this?" Dr. Chun gestured toward the medal in his hands and the changes that had swept through military medicine in the wake of the creature's revelations. "I think it knew exactly what would happen. The organism didn't just document crimes. It orchestrated their exposure. Everything from my survival to your assignment to Fort Braxton was part of a plan that the creature had been developing for years." As they visited the graves of other Echo 7 team members, Colin reflected on the transformation that had occurred in his understanding of service and sacrifice. He had entered the military believing that loyalty meant following orders without question. The organism's testimony had taught him that true loyalty sometimes required challenging authority and speaking uncomfortable truths. The congressional reforms that had followed the hearings had established new protections for military whistleblowers and created independent oversight mechanisms for all military medical research. The changes wouldn't bring back the soldiers who had died as test subjects, but they would prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Dr. Chen's work with the Veterans Affairs had already identified 43 additional soldiers who showed evidence of exposure to experimental biological agents. Many of them had suffered in silence for years, believing that their symptoms were the result of combat injuries or psychological trauma. The organism's testimony had given them both explanation and hope for treatment. Sarah had been thinking about something the organism communicated during those final minutes of transmission. What's that? It said that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent. Everything we've accomplished over the past 6 months has been about making sure that other soldiers don't experience what I went through. As they prepared to leave Arlington Cemetery, Colin took one last look at the graves of his teammates. The organism that had chosen him as its host was gone, but the justice it had sought for 50 years was finally being realized. General Stone and her co-conspirators were in prison. The biological weapons program had been disbanded, and new protections were in place to safeguard soldiers from exploitation. The creature that had been created by human cruelty, but had developed its own moral compass, had achieved something that many human institutions had failed to accomplish. It had held the powerful accountable for crimes committed against the powerless. Colin's Medal of Honor represented more than his individual courage. It acknowledged the sacrifice of every soldier who had died carrying secrets that were too dangerous to reveal while they were alive. The organism's testimony had given voice to the dead and protection to the living, fulfilling the promise that had sustained it through decades of patient waiting. As they walked toward the cemetery's entrance, Dr. Chun slipped her hand into Colin's, and he felt the peace that came from knowing that his burden had been transformed into purpose. The organism was gone, but its legacy would live on in the lives of soldiers who would never have to face the choice between loyalty and truth that had defined his own journey. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white headstones, creating patterns of light and darkness that reminded Colin of the bioluminescent displays that had marked the organism's final testimony. The creature had been a living example of how even the products of human cruelty could choose justice over revenge, truth over survival, and hope over despair. In the end, the organism's greatest achievement wasn't the exposure of military corruption or the punishment of war criminals. It was the demonstration that the moral arc of the universe, while long, does indeed bend toward justice when individuals have the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost.